The words still echoed in my mind 3 days later, sharp as broken glass cutting through every quiet moment. The bride's father was more of a dad than you ever were, Bruce. You're not welcome at my wedding. Mason had delivered this verdict through the phone, his voice cold and clinical, like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed. 30 years old, my only son, and he spoke to me like I was a stranger who'd overstayed his welcome. The dial tone that followed felt like a door slamming shut on everything I'd tried to rebuild between us. I sat in my empty kitchen, staring at the wedding invitation I'd received 2 months earlier. Elegant cream cardstock with gold lettering. Mason Johnson and Sarah Mitchell request your presence. Johnson. He'd legally changed his name from Matthews when he turned 18, trading my surname for his mother's maiden name like he was returning a defective product. The bride's father. Robert Mitchell. Successful real estate developer, community pillar, the man who'd stepped into Mason's life when he was 15 and struggling with our messy divorce. While I was working 60-hour weeks trying to keep my construction business afloat and pay alimony, Robert was teaching Mason to drive, attending his baseball games, taking him on fishing trips to his cabin upstate. I understood why Mason preferred him. Robert had money, stability, presence. Everything I'd failed to provide during those chaotic years after the divorce. When Linda left me, she'd taken half of everything, including my confidence as a father. The business nearly went under. I was drinking too much, sleeping too little, and Mason paid the price for my inability to handle falling apart gracefully. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd built houses for other families while failing to build a relationship with my own son. Every weekend, visit became shorter, more strained. Mason would sit in my living room like he was serving a prison sentence, answering my questions with single words, checking his phone constantly. When he started spending weekends at his friend's house instead, I told myself it was temporary. Teenage rebellion. He'd come around. He never did. Robert entered the picture like a perfectly timed rescue operation. Divorced himself, no children of his own, financially secure enough to lavish attention on Linda and Mason, without the stress that had crushed me. Within a year, Mason was calling him Dad and introducing me to friends as Bruce when I bothered to show up at all. I stopped fighting for custody when Mason turned 16 and begged the judge to let him choose where he lived. The look of relief on his face when the decision was finalized still haunted me. My own son, grateful to be legally freed from spending time with me. The last real conversation we'd had was 3 years ago at his college graduation. Robert had paid for the ceremony, the party afterward, even Mason's apartment near campus. I stood on the periphery of the celebration, watching my son accept congratulations and praise for achievements I'd had no part in supporting. When I approached to offer my own congratulations, Mason's smile flickered like a candle in the wind. "Thanks for coming," he'd said, the kind of polite acknowledgement you'd give a distant relative at a funeral. No warmth, no recognition of the years I'd spent hoping he'd need me again someday. Now he was getting married, and Robert would walk him down the aisle. Robert would give the father of the groom speech. Robert would dance with the bride while I sat at home, uninvited and unwanted, 49 years old and completely alone. The smart thing would be to respect his wishes. Send a gift, maybe a card with a generic message about happiness and new beginnings. Keep my distance and let him have his perfect day without the complication of my presence. That's what a good father would do, right? Put his son's happiness above his own need for inclusion. But sitting in that kitchen, surrounded by the silence of a house that had never quite felt like a home after Linda left, I couldn't bring myself to accept permanent exile from Mason's life. Not on the most important day of his life, not when there might never be another chance to show him that I'd changed, that I'd learned something about being the father he'd needed all along. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd saved over the years, screenshots from Mason's social media posts that I followed like a private investigator tracking a suspect, his graduation from business school, the promotion at Robert's real estate firm, the engagement announcement with Sarah, a beautiful young woman who looked at Mason like he hung the moon. In every photo, Mason looked genuinely happy, confident, successful. Everything a father should want for his son, except his father hadn't been part of creating any of it. Robert had built the man Mason had become, while I'd remained frozen in the memory of a struggling 15-year-old boy who'd needed more than I'd known how to give. The wedding was tomorrow. St. Mark's Cathedral downtown. 2 o'clock ceremony followed by a reception at the Riverside Country Club. I'd driven past the church twice this week, telling myself I was just running errands in the neighborhood. The truth was, I was trying to imagine what it would feel like to watch my son promise his life to someone else while another man stood in my place. I opened my laptop and found the construction company's schedule for tomorrow. 3 jobs running, all of them manageable without me for a few hours. My foreman could handle the crew, the clients wouldn't miss me for one afternoon. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened kitchen window. 50 years old, grey creeping through my hair, lines around my eyes that hadn't been there when Mason was young. I looked like what I was, a man who'd spent 15 years learning lessons too late to matter, but maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still something worth salvaging between us, some small foundation we could build on, if I had the courage to show up and face his rejection one more time. I reached for the phone to call him, to try one more time to explain, to apologize, to beg if necessary. Then I stopped. Words had failed us for 15 years. Maybe it was time to let actions speak instead. Tomorrow I would go to the church. I would sit in the back, where I wouldn't disturb anyone or embarrass Mason. I would watch my son marry the woman he loved, and I would be grateful for the chance to witness his happiness, even from a distance, even if he never forgave me for being there. I parked 3 blocks away from St. Mark's Cathedral, my hands trembling slightly as I turned off the engine. The dashboard clock read 1:45. 15 minutes before the ceremony would begin, enough time to slip in unnoticed and find a seat in the back corner where I could observe without disrupting Mason's perfect day. The summer afternoon was gorgeous, the kind of weather that made you believe good things were possible. Sunlight filtered through the cathedral's stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the stone steps where wedding guests climbed in their finest clothes. I recognized a few faces from Mason's high school years, neighbors from the old subdivision where we'd lived when he was young, before everything fell apart. I waited until most of the guests had entered before approaching the cathedral. My navy suit felt tight across my shoulders, a remnant from more optimistic days when I'd imagined attending family celebrations as an honored guest rather than an unwelcome intruder. The jacket still smelled faintly of mothballs from its long stay in the closet. The cathedral doors stood open, revealing glimpses of flower arrangements and candlelight inside. Soft organ music drifted out, classical pieces I didn't recognize, but that sounded appropriately elegant for the occasion. This was exactly the kind of wedding Mason deserved, sophisticated and beautiful, the kind of ceremony I could never have afforded to give him. I approached the entrance and nodded to the ushers, young men in matching black tuxedos who were probably Sarah's cousins or college friends. They looked at me with polite confusion, checking their guest list and finding my name absent. Before they could ask questions, I smiled and said I was running late, slipping past them into the cathedral's dim interior. The space was breathtaking. Hundreds of guests filled the wooden pews, their conversations creating a warm buzz of anticipation. White roses and baby's breath decorated every surface, and candles flickered in tall brass stands along the aisle. At the front of the church, an altar draped in silk waited for the ceremony to begin. I found an empty spot in the last pew, tucked behind a large family whose children provided excellent camouflage. From here I could see everything without being noticed. The groom's side was packed with faces I didn't recognize, people who'd become important to Mason during the years we'd spent apart. Robert Mitchell sat in the front row, impeccably dressed and radiating the confidence of a man who belonged exactly where he was. The organ music changed, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. The wedding party appeared at the front of the church. Groomsmen in charcoal gray, bridesmaids in soft blue dresses that complemented the flowers perfectly. They took their positions with practiced precision, smiling at the guests and each other. Then Mason appeared. My breath caught in my throat. He looked magnificent in his black tuxedo, tall and confident, his dark hair perfectly styled. At 30 years old, he'd grown into the kind of man who commanded attention without trying, successful and self-assured in ways I'd never been at his age. But what stopped my heart was how happy he looked, genuinely radiant with joy as he took his place at the altar. Robert Mitchell rose from the front pew and joined Mason, placing a hand on his shoulder with the easy familiarity of a father proud of his son. They spoke quietly to each other, Robert offering what looked like last-minute encouragement or advice. Mason nodded and smiled, clearly drawing strength from the older man's presence. This should have been my moment. In another life, In a version of our story where I'd been stronger and wiser and better, I would have been the one standing beside Mason, sharing this milestone with him. Instead, I was a stranger in the back row, watching another man fulfill the role I'd forfeited through my own failures. The organ swelled again, and Sarah appeared at the back of the cathedral. She was stunning in her white gown, a vision of grace and beauty that made the entire congregation turn to admire her. But I couldn't take my eyes off Mason's face as he watched his bride approach. The love there was unmistakable, pure and overwhelming, the kind of emotion that made you believe in happy endings. Sarah's father, a distinguished man in his 60s, walked her down the aisle with obvious pride. They moved slowly, savoring each step of this traditional ritual. When they reached the altar, he kissed Sarah's cheek and placed her hand in Mason's with a gesture that said he was entrusting his daughter to someone worthy of her love. Father Martinez, the cathedral's elderly priest, stepped forward to begin the ceremony. I'd heard he'd been serving St. Mark's for over 20 years, officiating countless weddings for the city's prominent families. His voice carried easily through the cathedral as he welcomed the guests and spoke about the sacredness of marriage, the commitment Mason and Sarah were making before God and their community. "Dearly beloved," Father Martinez began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Mason Johnson and Sarah Mitchell in holy matrimony. This is a sacred covenant, blessed by God and celebrated by all who love them." I found myself holding my breath as the familiar words washed over me. Despite everything, despite the pain and regret and years of silence between us, I was grateful to be here, grateful to witness Mason's happiness, even from a distance. This was enough. It had to be enough. Father Martinez continued through the opening prayers and readings, his voice warm and reassuring. Sarah's sister read from Corinthians about love being patient and kind. Mason's best friend, someone I didn't recognize, offered a reading from Ecclesiastes about there being a time for everything under heaven. The ceremony proceeded beautifully, exactly as weddings should. Mason and Sarah exchanged personal vows that made several guests reach for tissues. Their words to each other spoke of partnership, adventure, and a love that had grown stronger through shared dreams and challenges. They talked about building a life together, creating a family, becoming the people they were meant to be. Father Martinez called for the rings, and the best man stepped forward with the small velvet box. This was the moment when everything would become official, when Mason would become a married man and begin the next chapter of his life. I should have felt closure, a sense that my parental duty to witness this milestone was complete. Instead, I felt something shift in the cathedral's atmosphere. Father Martinez had taken the rings and was preparing to bless them when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His face changed, becoming troubled and uncertain. He looked down at the rings in his hands, then up at Mason and Sarah, then out at the congregation. He began, then stopped again. The cathedral fell silent except for the sound of people shifting in their seats, confused by the interruption. Father Martinez set the rings down on the altar and clasped his hands together. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made everyone lean forward. "I cannot in good conscience continue this ceremony without first sharing something that has come to my attention, something that changes everything we thought we knew about this union." A murmur of confusion rippled through the guests. Mason's face went pale, and Sarah reached for his hand. Robert Mitchell half rose from his seat in the front row, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked almost like fear. Father Martinez turned to face the congregation fully, his weathered face grave with the burden of whatever he was about to reveal. "What I must tell you will be difficult to hear, but the truth cannot be hidden, especially not at the altar of God." Father Martinez's words hung in the cathedral air like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. The silence that followed was absolute, 200 people holding their breath as one. I could see Mason's shoulders tense beneath his tuxedo jacket, Sarah's bouquet trembling in her hands. "Yesterday evening," Father Martinez continued, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's perfect acoustics, "a man came to me in great distress. He requested the sacrament of confession, seeking absolution for a sin that has haunted him for over 20 years. Robert Mitchell was fully standing now, his face drained of all color. I watched him from my position in the back pew, noting how his hands gripped the wooden rail in front of him like he was trying to keep himself upright. Something cold began forming in my stomach. While the seal of confession is sacred and inviolable, Father Martinez said. "This man specifically asked me to share his burden with this congregation. He said he could no longer live with the deception, especially not today, especially not while witnessing what he called the ultimate betrayal of everything sacred about family." Mason stepped forward slightly, his voice tight with confusion and growing alarm. "Father Martinez, I don't understand what this has to do with our wedding. If someone has a personal matter to discuss, surely it can wait until after the ceremony." The priest's eyes moved from Mason to Robert Mitchell, who had begun shaking his head slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was the gesture of a man watching his world collapse in real time. "Mr. Johnson," Father Martinez said gently, using the name Mason had chosen for himself, "what I'm about to tell you concerns your very identity, your family, and the man you've chosen to honor as your father figure." A gasp rippled through the congregation. Sarah's mother covered her mouth with her hand. Several guests began whispering to each other, sensing scandal but not yet understanding its scope. Father Martinez turned to face Robert Mitchell directly. "Mr. Mitchell, you asked me to reveal your confession publicly. Are you prepared for the consequences of that revelation?" Robert's voice came out as barely a whisper, but in the cathedral silence, everyone heard him. "Tell them." My heart began pounding as pieces of a puzzle I didn't know existed started falling into place. Robert Mitchell's sudden appearance in Mason's life, the immediate bond between them, the way Robert had seemed to know exactly what Mason needed, exactly how to fill the void I'd left behind. 21 years ago, Father Martinez began, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelation, Robert Mitchell had an affair with a married woman. This relationship resulted in the birth of a child, a son, born on March 15th, 2003. The date hit me like a physical blow. March 15th, 2003, Mason's birthday. The woman was Linda Matthews and the child was the boy we know as Mason Johnson. The cathedral erupted. Gasps, shouts of disbelief, the sound of someone fainting in the third row. Sarah dropped her bouquet, the white roses scattering across the marble floor. Mason stood frozen at the altar, his face cycling through confusion, denial, and dawning horror. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying in the sudden chaos. "No, that can't be right. That would mean—" She looked from Mason to her father, understanding flooding her features. "That would mean we're brother and sister," Father Martinez finished quietly. "Half-siblings, sharing the same biological father." The sound that came from Mason wasn't quite human. It was the cry of an animal caught in a trap, wounded and desperate. He turned to face Robert Mitchell, who was still standing in the front pew, tears streaming down his face. "You knew," Mason said, his voice rising with each word. "You knew who I was when you started dating my mother. You knew I was your son." Robert's composure finally shattered completely. "I suspected, but I wasn't certain until you were older, until I could see more of myself in your face. By then, I'd already fallen in love with the idea of being your father, the father I should have been from the beginning." The congregation was in complete chaos now. People were standing, talking loudly, some heading for the exits. Sarah's mother was sobbing openly while her relatives tried to comfort her. The wedding party stood at the altar in shock, unsure whether to flee or remain. But I couldn't take my eyes off Mason. My son, who'd spent 15 years believing I'd failed him as a father, was learning that the man he'd idolized, the man he'd chosen over me, was his biological father who'd abandoned him before birth. "You let me hate him," Mason said, pointing toward the back of the church. I realized with a start that he was pointing at me, that somehow in this chaos he'd spotted me in the last pew. "You let me believe Bruce was a failure, that he'd abandoned me when you were the one who was never there." Robert tried to approach the altar, but Mason backed away from him. "I never meant for it to happen this way. When I met your mother at that real estate conference, I had no idea she was married, no idea she was pregnant with my child. When she told me, I panicked. I was married myself then, building my business. I couldn't handle the scandal." "So you paid her to disappear," Mason said, the pieces clicking into place. "You paid her to raise your son alone and let another man think he was the father." "I gave her money to help with expenses," Robert admitted, "but Linda chose to stay with Bruce. She chose to let him believe you were his son. I respected that decision. Until 15 years later when you decided you wanted to play daddy after all." Mason's voice was raw with betrayal. "When you realized I'd grown into someone you could be proud of, someone who could make you look good." Sarah had sunk onto the altar steps, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled milk. "I can't marry my brother," she whispered. "I can't marry my brother." The truth of it hit the remaining guests like a second wave. This wasn't just about paternity fraud or family deception. This was about two young people who'd fallen in love, planned a life together, only to discover their relationship was genetically impossible. Father Martinez raised his hands, trying to restore some order to the chaos. "The ceremony cannot continue. This union cannot be blessed by the church. I'm sorry, but given these revelations, I must ask everyone to leave quietly and allow these families to process this information privately." But Mason wasn't done. He turned back to Robert, his face twisted with rage and pain. "How long have you known for certain? How long have you been lying to my face while I called you Dad?" Robert's voice broke completely. "Since your 18th birthday party. You mentioned changing your name legally, showed me your birth certificate. When I saw the dates, the hospital, I knew for certain. But by then you were my son in every way that mattered. I couldn't bear to lose you again." "So you decided to take Sarah too," Mason said, the full scope of Robert's selfishness becoming clear. "You encouraged our relationship. You gave me a job at your company knowing it would throw us together. You orchestrated everything so you could have both your children close, playing house with your secret family." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Robert's face crumpled as he realized that Mason had grasped the full extent of his manipulation. Not only had he hidden Mason's true parentage, he'd actively encouraged a romantic relationship between his biological children. "I never thought you'd fall in love," Robert whispered. "I thought it would just be friendship, working together, getting to know each other as family, without knowing that's what you were." "You thought wrong," Sarah said, rising from the altar steps with fury replacing her shock. "You let us plan a life together. You walked me down the aisle to marry my own brother. What kind of father does that?" The cathedral was emptying rapidly now, guests fleeing the scene of this family catastrophe. The wedding party had abandoned their positions, some comforting Sarah, others simply escaping the nightmare unfolding at what should have been a celebration. But I remained in the back pew, watching my son face the destruction of everything he'd believed about his life, his family, his future. For 15 years, I'd carried the guilt of failing Mason as a father. Now I was watching him learn that the man he'd chosen to replace me had betrayed him in ways I never could have imagined. Mason looked up suddenly, his eyes scanning the nearly empty cathedral until they found mine. Across the space between us, father and son looked at each other for the first time in years, without the barrier of resentment and disappointment. In his eyes, I saw something I'd given up hoping for, recognition that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been the worst father after all. The cathedral had emptied except for the wedding party, immediate family, and a few stragglers too shocked to leave. I remained in my back pew, uncertain whether my presence would help or hurt Mason in this moment of complete devastation. The beautiful flowers and candles now seemed like decorations for a funeral rather than a celebration. Mason stood at the altar, still in his tuxedo, looking lost in a way I remembered from his childhood, when storms would wake him in the middle of the night. Sarah sat on the altar steps, her wedding dress spread around her, like she was a broken doll someone had dropped. Between them lay the scattered remains of her bouquet, white roses crushed and forgotten. Robert Mitchell remained in the front pew, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. The man who'd commanded respect and admiration for decades had been reduced to a broken figure, exposed as the architect of his own children's pain. "I need to understand," Mason said suddenly, his voice echoing in the mostly empty space. "I need to understand everything." He walked down from the altar toward Robert, his movements careful and controlled, like he was approaching a dangerous animal. "Start from the beginning. All of it." Robert looked up, his face streaked with tears and aged by the weight of his confession. "The conference in Denver, 1999. Your mother was there representing her accounting firm. I was expanding my business, looking for financial consultants. We met at the hotel bar after the first day of presentations. She was married," Mason stated, not a question but a demand for Robert to acknowledge the full scope of his actions. "She was unhappy," Robert said weakly. "She told me about problems at home, about feeling unappreciated, about Bruce working all the time and not understanding her ambitions. I felt that familiar stab of guilt, hearing my failings recounted, even though I now understood they'd been twisted into justification for betrayal. Linda had been unhappy. That much was true. I'd been working constantly, trying to build the construction business, and I'd failed to see how isolated she'd become. "So you seduced a married woman," Sarah said from the altar steps, her voice sharp with disgust. "You destroyed her marriage and then abandoned her when she needed you most." "It wasn't like that," Robert protested. "It was 3 days. 3 days where we connected, where I felt like I'd found someone who understood my drive, my vision for success. When we said goodbye, we both knew it was over." "But then she called you," Mason pressed. "She called to tell you she was pregnant." Robert's silence stretched long enough that I began to wonder if he would answer. Finally, he nodded. 2 months later, she was terrified. Her marriage was already strained and she was pregnant with another man's child. She didn't know what to do. "So you told her to lie," Mason said. "You told her to pretend I was Bruce's son." "I suggested it might be easier for everyone involved," Robert admitted. "Bruce would have a son, Linda would keep her marriage intact, and I could continue building my life without the complication of a child I wasn't prepared to raise." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. My son reduced to a complication in Robert's carefully planned life. All those years I'd wondered why Linda had been so distant during her pregnancy, so reluctant to talk about the future. She'd been carrying another man's child and pretending it was mine. "Did you give her money?" Sarah asked. "Did you pay her to keep your secret?" Robert's hesitation was answer enough. "I helped with medical expenses, made sure she had proper prenatal care. It wasn't a bribe, it was support." "It was a transaction," Mason corrected harshly. "You bought her silence and my legitimacy for the price of a few doctor visits." I found myself standing without conscious decision, walking down the center aisle toward the altar. Every step felt like crossing years of separation and misunderstanding. Mason watched me approach, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. "Mason," I said when I was close enough to speak without shouting, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you needed when you were growing up. I'm sorry I let work consume me. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for you after the divorce. But I need you to know I never knew. I never knew you weren't my biological son, and it wouldn't have mattered if I had." Mason's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back since Father Martinez first stopped the ceremony. "You raised me for 15 years thinking I was yours. You were mine," I said simply. "Biology doesn't make a father. Being there does. Caring does. Loving someone enough to keep trying even when they push you away does." "But I did push you away," Mason whispered. "I chose him over you. I legally changed my name. I called him Dad and introduced you as Bruce. I made you feel like a stranger in your own son's life." "Because you were manipulated," Sarah said, rising from the altar steps and joining our conversation. "Because he created a situation where you had to choose, and he made sure he looked like the better option." Robert finally stood from the front pew, turning to face the three of us clustered near the altar. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. When I started dating Linda, when I got to know Mason, I fell in love with the idea of being his father. He was everything I'd dreamed a son could be." "But you already had a daughter," Mason said, gesturing toward Sarah. "You had a family." "Sarah's mother and I were having problems," Robert said. "Sarah was away at college, growing up, becoming independent. When I saw the young man you'd become, saw your potential, I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to guide you, to give you opportunities, to be the father I'd failed to be when you were born." "By stealing him from his real father," Sarah said. "By convincing him that Bruce had failed him when the only person who'd failed him was you." The truth of it hit Mason like a physical blow. He turned to me with eyes full of recognition and regret. "All those times you tried to stay involved, all those invitations I turned down, those weekends I chose to spend somewhere else rather than with you, you kept trying." "I kept hoping," I corrected. "I kept believing that someday you'd need your dad, and I wanted to be ready when that day came." "You never stopped fighting for me," Mason said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Even when I legally changed my name, even when I called another man Dad, even when I told you you weren't welcome at my wedding, you came anyway." "I couldn't miss your wedding," I said. "Even if you didn't want me there, I couldn't miss the most important day of your life." Mason looked around the destroyed cathedral, at the scattered flowers and abandoned wedding cake visible through the sacristy door, at Sarah in her ruined wedding dress, at Robert still weeping in the front pew. "There isn't going to be a wedding," he said quietly. "There can't be a wedding." Sarah approached him slowly, carefully, like she was approaching a wounded animal. "We can't marry each other, but that doesn't change how I feel about you. It doesn't change the love, just the way we can express it. How do we come back from this, Mason asked. How do we rebuild our lives when everything we thought we knew was a lie? One truth at a time, I said. Starting with this. You're my son, Mason. Not because we share blood, but because I raised you, loved you, and never stopped hoping we'd find our way back to each other. That's never going to change. Mason looked at me for a long moment, then stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me in a hug that felt like coming home after years of being lost. I held my son and felt 15 years of regret and disappointment begin to crack apart, making room for something new to grow. I'm sorry, Dad, he whispered against my shoulder. I'm so sorry I chose him over you. You chose what looked like stability and success, I said. You chose what any smart young man would choose. You couldn't have known his motives were selfish. Over Mason's shoulder, I saw Robert Mitchell watching us with something that might have been envy or regret. He'd gotten what he wanted, a relationship with his biological son, but he'd built it on lies and manipulation. Now he was losing everything: his daughter's respect, his son's love, his reputation in the community. Sarah joined our embrace, and for a moment, the three of us stood together, in the ruins of what should have been the happiest day of their lives, holding each other against the magnitude of betrayal and loss. What happens now? Sarah asked. Mason pulled back from our embrace, but kept one hand on my shoulder, like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go completely. Now we figure out how to be a family, the right kind of family built on truth instead of lies. He turned to face Robert, who was still standing alone in the front pew. And you stay away from us, all of us. You've done enough damage for one lifetime. Robert opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg for forgiveness or offer more explanations. But Mason cut him off. No more words. No more manipulations. No more playing with people's lives for your own satisfaction. You wanted to be our father, but fathers protect their children. They don't use them. The dismissal was final, absolute. Robert Mitchell, the man who'd seemed so powerful and successful, left the cathedral like a man carrying the weight of his own destruction. The weeks following the wedding that never was felt like living in the aftermath of a natural disaster. Mason moved out of the apartment Robert had helped him secure and crashed on my couch while he figured out his next steps. Sarah stayed with her mother, both of them trying to process the betrayal that had shattered their family. The first few days were awkward beyond description. Mason and I hadn't shared living space since he was 16, and we'd both changed dramatically in the years since. He was a successful businessman, accustomed to luxury and independence. I was a 50-year-old bachelor set in routines that hadn't included another person in over a decade. But slowly, carefully, we began to remember how to be father and son. It started with small things. Mason making coffee in the morning because he couldn't sleep past 6, a habit ingrained from years of early business meetings. Me cooking dinner because I'd learned to find peace in simple domestic tasks during my long years alone. We'd eat together at my kitchen table, the same one where he'd done homework as a child, and attempt conversations that went beyond the basic politeness of strangers. I keep thinking about things differently now, Mason said one evening, picking at the lasagna I'd made from Linda's old recipe. Memories I thought I understood. Like that time you missed my baseball championship because of work. I remembered. The Riverside project had hit complications, and I'd spent the weekend trying to save a contract that would have meant months of steady work for my crew. I'd promised Mason I'd make the next game, but there hadn't been a next game. The season was over, and he'd celebrated his victory with Robert Mitchell, who'd happened to be in the stands scouting Sarah's game on the adjacent field. You were building something, Mason continued, working 16-hour days to keep the business alive, to pay Mum's alimony, to keep me in decent clothes and a good school district. Robert just showed up at the right moment and took credit for caring. I should have been there, I said. I should have found a way to be at that game. Maybe, Mason agreed. But you were trying to be a provider. He was trying to be impressive. There's a difference. These conversations happened gradually, over shared meals and quiet evenings, when the weight of recent revelations made us both too drained for pretense. Mason would remember something about his childhood and reframe it through his new understanding of our family dynamics. I'd share stories about the years after our relationship fractured, the jobs I'd taken to stay busy, the nights I'd driven past his high school just hoping to catch a glimpse of him. You never stopped trying, he said one night. Even when I was horrible to you, even when I changed my name and acted ashamed of being your son, you kept reaching out. I kept hoping, I corrected. That's what parents do. We hope our kids will come back to us someday. Sarah visited regularly during those first weeks, drawn by the strange comfort of being with the only people who understood the magnitude of what Robert's deception had cost them. She'd lost her fiancé, her future, and her faith in the father she'd always trusted, but she'd also gained something unexpected. A brother who loved her without the complication of romance, and an extended family willing to support her through the crisis. I keep wondering if there were signs, she said one afternoon, sitting on my back porch with Mason while I grilled burgers. Things I should have noticed about Dad's behavior, about the way he pushed us together. He's a master manipulator, Mason replied. He spent years perfecting the art of making his selfishness look like generosity. We were just his latest project. Sarah had quit her job at Robert's real estate company immediately after the wedding disaster. The scandal had spread through their professional community with the speed that only truly shocking gossip could achieve. Robert Mitchell, respected businessman and community leader, exposed as a man who'd orchestrated a relationship between his own children. The story had everything: secret paternity, family betrayal, forbidden love discovered at the altar. "I can't stay in this city," Sarah announced during one of our evening conversations. "Everywhere I go, people stare, they whisper. Some of them feel sorry for me. Others act like I should have known somehow. I need to start over somewhere else." Mason understood. His position at Robert's company had become untenable as well, not just because of the family drama, but because his colleagues couldn't separate the skilled professional from the scandal surrounding his personal life. He'd been fielding calls from competitors interested in hiring him, businesses that saw opportunity in Robert's downfall. "There's a development firm in Portland that's offered me a position," he said. "Commercial real estate, sustainable building practices. It's everything I was trying to convince Robert to pursue here." "Portland's beautiful," I said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. I'd just gotten my son back and now he was planning to leave again. Mason must have heard something in my voice because he looked at me sharply. "Come with me." The suggestion hung in the air between us like a challenge. "Mason, I can't just pack up and move across the country. I have a business here, obligations, contracts to fulfill." "You have 3 employees, and most of your work is residential renovation," he countered. "That translates anywhere. Portland's building boom means plenty of opportunities for quality contractors." "I don't know anything about living in a big city," I protested. "I've spent my whole life in small towns. I don't know anything about having a father who actually wants to be involved in my life," Mason replied. "We'll both be learning something new." The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Starting over at 50, leaving behind the familiar disappointments and limitations of the life I'd built here, taking a risk on the relationship Mason and I were still rebuilding. "What about Sarah?" I asked. "There's a non-profit in Portland that works with domestic abuse survivors," she said. "They need someone with business experience to help restructure their operations. It's not real estate, but it's a chance to use my skills for something meaningful." "So we'd all go together," I said slowly. "All 3 of us starting over in a new place. Not together like we're running away," Mason clarified. "Together like we're choosing to be a family, despite everything that's tried to tear us apart." I thought about it for days. The practical considerations were daunting. Selling my house, liquidating the business, starting over professionally in a competitive market. But the alternative was watching Mason and Sarah rebuild their lives hundreds of miles away, while I remained in a town full of reminders of everything that had gone wrong. Robert had been calling Mason regularly since the wedding disaster, leaving voicemails that ranged from desperate apologies to angry demands for forgiveness. Mason had blocked his number, but the messages found their way through mutual contacts and business associates. Robert couldn't accept that his carefully constructed family fantasy had collapsed, that his biological children wanted nothing to do with him. "He sent me a letter," Sarah told us one evening. 5 pages of explanations and justifications. He still doesn't understand what he did wrong. He thinks if he can just explain his motives clearly enough, we'll forgive him and go back to pretending we're a normal family. "What did you do with the letter?" Mason asked. "Burned it," she replied without hesitation. "I'm done giving him opportunities to manipulate my emotions." The finality in her voice convinced me. These 2 young people had been forced to grow up fast, to see through pretty lies and recognize manipulation for what it was. They deserved the chance to build something honest together, even if that meant walking away from everything familiar. "Okay," I said. "Let's do it. Let's go to Portland." Mason's smile was brighter than anything I'd seen from him since before the divorce. Really? You're willing to take that kind of risk? The biggest risk would be staying here and letting you slip away again, I replied. I've already lost 15 years with you. I'm not losing any more. We spent the next month making plans. Mason gave notice at Robert's company. Enduring awkward conversations with colleagues who didn't know how to address the scandal, Sarah completed her transition away from her father's business, cutting all professional and personal ties with surgical precision. I began the process of selling my house and finding buyers for my construction contracts. The hardest part was facing the judgment of people who'd known our family for years. Some were supportive, understanding that we needed a fresh start away from the gossip and speculation. Others seemed to think we were running away from problems we should face head-on. Let them think what they want, Mason said, when I expressed concern about our reputation in the community. We know the truth about what happened. We know we're not running away. We're running towards something better. The day before we left for Portland, Sarah and I had lunch together while Mason handled the final details of his job transition. We'd grown closer during the weeks of shared crisis, bonding over the strange situation of being almost family members, navigating an unprecedented relationship. "Are you nervous?" she asked over sandwiches at the diner where Mason and I had been eating regularly. "Terrified," I admitted. "I've never lived anywhere but here. Never had to start over completely." "But you're doing it anyway," she observed. "You're choosing Mason's future over your own comfort." "I'm choosing our future," I corrected. "All of us. Whatever we're building together, it's bigger than just father and son." She smiled, and for the first time since the wedding disaster, it reached her eyes. "I used to think family was about blood and tradition and maintaining appearances. Now I think it's about choosing to love people even when it's complicated." "Especially when it's complicated," I agreed. That evening, Mason and I sat on my back porch for the last time, watching the sunset over the neighborhood where he'd grown up. Tomorrow, we'd load our belongings into a moving truck and drive toward an uncertain but hopeful future. "Are you sure about this?" I asked him. "Giving up everything you've built here to start over with your old man?" "I'm not giving up anything that matters," he replied. "I'm finally getting back what I lost years ago. I'm getting my father back." 2 years later, I stood in the living room of our Portland home watching Mason hang family photos on the wall we'd just finished painting. The house was a craftsman-style bungalow in the Selwood neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but solid and well-built. The kind of home that would appreciate with care and attention. We'd bought it together, father and son, pooling our resources to create something neither of us could have afforded alone. "Hand me that level," Mason said, adjusting a frame that held our first family photo in over 15 years. We'd taken it at Sarah's graduation ceremony when she received her certification in non-profit management. All three of us grinning at the camera, Sarah in her cap and gown flanked by the 2 men who'd become her chosen family. The construction business I'd started in Portland was thriving beyond my expectations. Turns out, there was high demand for quality craftsmanship among homeowners who appreciated attention to detail over speed and profit margins. Mason had joined the company 6 months after we arrived, bringing his business development skills and vision for sustainable building practices. We'd found our rhythm as partners, complementing each other's strengths in ways I'd never imagined possible. "Remember when you used to help me hang pictures when you were 10? I asked, steadying the frame while he marked the wall. "You insisted on using the level for everything, even the smallest nail holes." "I wanted everything to be perfect," Mason replied, smiling at the memory. "I thought if I could just make everything straight and even, nothing would ever fall down." "Some things are worth the extra effort to get right," I said, and we both understood I wasn't talking about wall hangings. Sarah lived 15 minutes away in a converted warehouse apartment she'd found in the Arts District. Her work, with the domestic abuse nonprofit, had evolved into a consulting practice, helping organizations restructure their operations for maximum impact. She'd discovered a talent for seeing systems clearly and building sustainable solutions, skills that had been wasted in Robert's company, where her primary job had been looking impressive at client meetings. She joined us for dinner every Sunday, a tradition we'd established shortly after arriving in Portland. Tonight would be special because she was bringing someone new, a woman named Jennifer she'd been dating for 6 months. Sarah had been hesitant to introduce Jennifer to us, worried about how we'd react to the relationship that had grown out of their work together. "She makes me laugh," Sarah had explained when she first mentioned Jennifer. "After everything that happened with the wedding with Robert, I didn't think I'd ever trust anyone enough to fall in love again. But Jennifer is different. She's honest about everything, even when it's complicated. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. Sarah was always punctual, another trait she'd inherited from Robert along with his green eyes and stubborn streak. But unlike Robert, Sarah used her precision to honor commitments rather than manipulate situations to her advantage. "Dad, Mason, I'd like you to meet Jennifer," Sarah said as I opened the door. Jennifer was petite with short auburn hair and laugh lines that suggested she smiled often. She shook my hand with a firm grip and looked me directly in the eyes. "Sarah's told me so much about you both," Jennifer said, "about how you rebuilt your family after everything fell apart. It's inspiring." "We're still rebuilding," Mason said, appearing from the kitchen with a dish towel draped over his shoulder. "But we're getting better at it." Dinner was relaxed and comfortable, in a way our family gatherings had never been when Robert was orchestrating them. No performance, no careful positioning for maximum effect, just 4 people sharing food and conversation. Jennifer fit into our dynamic easily, listening more than she spoke but contributing thoughtful questions that showed she was genuinely interested in understanding our unusual family story. "Sarah mentioned that you used to work in corporate consulting," I said to Jennifer as we cleared the dinner dishes. "What made you switch to non-profit work?" "I got tired of helping rich people get richer," she replied honestly. "I wanted to use my skills for something that actually mattered." When I met Sarah and learned about her background, her transition from real estate to advocacy work, it felt like meeting someone who understood that success isn't just about profit margins. "Sarah's always been good at seeing the bigger picture," Mason said. "Even when we were engaged, she used to talk about wanting to do something meaningful with her business degree." It was the first time in months that anyone had referenced the engagement directly. For a while, the subject had been too painful, too loaded with reminders of betrayal and loss, but time and distance had given us perspective on what we'd gained versus what we'd lost. "I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was finding out I couldn't marry the man I loved," Sarah said. "Now I think the worst thing would have been marrying him without knowing we were siblings. At least this way, we got to choose our relationship instead of stumbling into something wrong. Plus," Mason added with a grin, "I make a much better brother than I would have made a husband. I'm way too messy to live with romantically." Jennifer laughed, and Sarah leaned against Mason's shoulder with the easy affection of siblings who'd learned to love each other properly. Watching them together, I felt a contentment I hadn't experienced since Mason was young, before divorce and secrets and manipulation had poisoned our family well. After Jennifer and Sarah left, Mason and I cleaned up the kitchen together, another ritual that had evolved naturally from our shared living situation. We'd learned to coordinate our movements around each other, to divide tasks efficiently, to create order from the comfortable chaos of family life. "She's good for Sarah," I said, rinsing plates while Mason loaded the dishwasher. "Jennifer seems genuine." "Sarah's gotten good at recognizing authenticity," Mason replied. "She's had enough experience with fake people to appreciate the real thing." We worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Mason spoke again. "I got a call from Robert yesterday." I nearly dropped the plate I was washing. Robert Mitchell hadn't contacted any of us directly in over a year, though we'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd sold his real estate company and moved to Arizona. The scandal had destroyed his reputation in our hometown, making it impossible for him to continue operating his business effectively. "What did he want?" I asked carefully. "To apologize," he said. "To explain that he's been in therapy, working on understanding why he made the choices he did. He wanted me to know that he's finally taking responsibility for the damage he caused." "How do you feel about that?" Mason was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "I feel like it's too late for apologies to matter. He had 21 years to tell the truth, and he chose deception every single time. Now that his lies have cost him everything, he wants forgiveness." "Forgiveness isn't for him," I said. "It's for you, for your peace of mind." "I know that," Mason replied, "and I think I have forgiven him, in the sense that I'm not angry anymore. I don't wish him harm. But forgiveness doesn't mean I want him back in my life. Some betrayals are too fundamental to overcome." I understood. The relationship between Mason and Robert couldn't be repaired because it had been built on lies from the beginning. There was no authentic foundation to return to, no genuine connection to rebuild. Robert had loved the idea of having a perfect son, but he'd never actually known Mason well enough to love him for who he really was. "He asked if he could see Sarah too," Mason continued. I told him that wasn't my decision to make, but that I doubted she'd be interested. Probably not, I agreed. Sarah had been even more decisive than Mason in cutting Robert out of her life. She'd changed her name back to her mother's maiden name, Mitchell, carrying too many painful associations. She was Sarah Chen now, claiming her heritage and independence simultaneously. We finished cleaning the kitchen and moved to the living room, where Mason had left his laptop open to architectural plans for our next project. A young couple had hired us to renovate a 100-year-old house in the Hawthorne district, updating the systems while preserving the original character. It was exactly the kind of work we'd both come to love, taking something damaged and making it beautiful again. "I've been thinking about something," Mason said, settling onto the couch with his laptop. "About the business, about our future here." "What kind of thinking?" "The kind where I wonder if you'd be interested in making this partnership official. Legal documents, shared ownership, Matthews and Son construction." The suggestion caught me off guard. I'd assumed Mason was working with me temporarily, building experience and capital before striking out on his own. The idea that he wanted to formalize our partnership, to commit to building something together long-term, felt like receiving an unexpected gift. "You want to tie yourself to an old man who's still figuring out how to run a business in a new city?" I asked. "I want to build something with my father," Mason replied. "Something honest and solid that we can both be proud of. Something that proves we learned from the past instead of being destroyed by it." I looked around our living room, at the family photos Mason had hung with such care, at the evidence of the life we'd built together through patience and forgiveness, and sheer stubborn determination. 2 years ago, I'd been a man with no family, watching my son marry someone else while another man stood in my place. Now I was part of something real and growing, a family we'd chosen to create rather than one we'd simply been born into. "Matthews and Son construction," I said, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." Mason smiled, the same smile that had lit up his face when he was young and something had exceeded his expectations. "Good, because I already had business cards printed." He reached into his laptop bag and pulled out a small box of cards, cream-colored with dark green lettering. Our names were listed as equal partners, no hierarchy, no suggestion that one of us was more important than the other. At the bottom, in smaller print, it read, "Building something that lasts." "When did you have these made?" I asked, running my finger over the embossed lettering. "Last month, after we finished the Chen project, and Mrs. Chen said we worked together like we'd been partners for 20 years instead of 20 months. I studied the business card, this tangible proof that my son wanted to build a future with me, that our relationship had moved beyond repair into genuine partnership. The weight of it, the permanence it represented, made my throat tight with emotion. "You know," I said finally, "this isn't how I imagined our story would end when you banned me from your wedding." "It's not ending," Mason replied. "It's just beginning. We lost a lot of years, but we've got a lot more ahead of us to make up for it." He was right. We had time now, stretching out before us like an unbuilt house full of possibility. Time to continue learning how to be father and son, without the interference of manipulation and lies. Time to build Matthews and Son construction into something we could be proud of. Time to watch Sarah flourish in her new life with Jennifer. Time to create the family we should have been all along. Outside our window, Portland's lights twinkled in the gathering darkness, a city full of people starting over, building new lives, creating families from whatever materials they had available. We were part of that now, part of a place that valued authenticity over tradition, genuine connection over perfect appearances. I handed the business card back to Mason and watched him smile as he tucked it into his wallet. Tomorrow we'd start work on the Hawthorne house, another damaged foundation that needed patient rebuilding. But tonight, we were home, father and son, finally building something that would last.